So, welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Presentation by Aubrey Miller, candidate for the chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. Aubrey's background includes training in medicine, receiving an MPH as well, residency, environmental and occupational medicine, and internal medicine, the EIS, as well, and service within the federal government in various sectors, including the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, Environmental Protection Agency, and more recently at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, where he's the Deputy Director for Science Coordination. I think importantly, he's co-chair of the NIH-wide Climate Change and Health Initiative and has been quite involved in leadership in that area. His scholarship really reflects his experience in the applied world of public health and practice, and following up on various circumstances in which there were environmental exposures, sometimes of disastrous scale, like the Deepwater Horizon spill, where he was involved with the workers. Is still ongoing story and others. So thanks. We're pleased to have you here with us. Aubrey, we've not bringing forth our best weather, but he's been living.
So a lot of interest, obviously, in climate change. The WHO has put out the impacts of environmental health, and it's hard to quantify, but 23% of global deaths are linked to the environment. With they expect by 2050 that up to 250,000 additional deaths per year will be due to malnutrition, heat-related illness, malaria. No, this is not working. All sorts of issues. I think I'll just go this way. I'll just do it this way. Okay. All right. We got it. So NIEHS, again, our focus is on looking and understanding how health and how environment affects our health and disease. A big push under Linda Birnbaum prior was also thinking about genetic and epigenetic markers. We're moving more into some other areas right now, climate change being a particular one, but also how environment affects our life, our timing of exposure through our life. And one thing Linda Birnbaum used to love to say is environmental factors are more readily identified and modified than genetic factors. You can't change your genes, but you can change your environment. So the heavy emphasis of NIH for over a decade and under the leadership of Francis Collins was really focused about genetics. And now we'll understand that genetics is not going to solve our problems, and thinking much more deeply about how we can pick up and understand environment and include environment, not only in understanding the etiologic risks, but how environment's affecting health outcomes going forward. So I guess talking a little bit about this and in the fact that, my passion has been in understanding environment and occupational health, and how all of these things that are in our milieu are really coming together and affecting our lives, and being able to understand what people do for a living and understand how those impacts our life effectively going forward. It's been a passion of mine, and it's been fun to be able to do the work in this space. We'll leave it at that. And John, you kind of set me up a little bit. So I started my career essentially coming out of residency, thinking about doing occupational medicine. I was actually interested even in ER medicine for a while, and then had the opportunity to start working in occupational health. And in Chicago, we got to work in factories and other places that we actually get some applied occupational health. And then came the EIS program, which gave me a chance to do applied experiences in the field, and then kind of worked through that into different areas and agencies. So my background's obviously different than the academic backgrounds that you're all in the sense of trying to think about and working with different agencies and the opportunities to think about these issues and environment and occupation and how it affects our communities and how we can apply it. Currently, as John mentioned, I was formerly the senior medical advisor to the director And now I am Deputy Director for Science Coordination. So I do representative work, expertise, coordination of our large programs, planning policy activities, and actually participate in research in some of the programs and projects that we get involved with. This is a picture of when we were working on the Gulf oil spill and doing Senate testimonies, and trying to do the representative work for the Institute. I'm going to cut back, I guess, and talk a little bit about opportunities and thinking about how do we learn applied science and doing it in the field. I think the EIS program is particularly great, and opportunities as you translate for folks that are early career and postdocs and stuff here, and community-based experiences, and how we give them opportunities in the field. This is a picture here from Grady Hospital. This was my EIS project. So the issue became what was the risk of TB transmission among hospital workers? And we actually implemented a large-scale study of 2,300 workers here in Grady Hospital to understand the nosocomial transmission of TB across that. So that was like a great learning experience of trying to do a cohort study, figuring out exposures, and then working across the medical establishment in Grady. So the fun stuff was, and this was the HHE program at NIOSH, the Hazard Evaluation Program, and it allowed people to train and go out, and it still exists, and to go out into the field and do interesting experiences in applied field work. So this was theatrical workers in Broadway were concerned, and they switched the smoke to an ethylene glycol-based smoke, and they were getting sick from the smoke. So the request for NIOSH was to actually go into theaters, and you know, of course, that's rough to do, and to measure and to do applied work. So the nice thing about it is working with industrial hygienists who are doing measurements, and then us doing pulmonary function, et cetera, on the differing work populations. In this case, we were looking at the theater actors, and a lot of the smoke was rolling over the stage and into the pit where the band's located, the orchestra. And so they were probably getting a larger dose. So opportunities to look at this particular one. We formed a construction-related program at NIOSH as well, and started to focus on construction-related health hazards. For this case, we did something unusual, but we started to string together, and this was an idea that I had, was to do the HHEs the same way across the country. Typically an HHE or health hazard evaluations done as an independent piece. We started to string them together and do asphalt paving. It was a request to look at asphalt and what they were putting into asphalt, which was crumb rubber, the old used tires that are being crowned up and put into asphalt. So additionally, that Kentucky and Cincinnati flooded in 1997. And this was an opportunity to start to think about what were the risks of disasters. So I was right there. I had been trained in and interested in emergency department work. And I requested to go out to Kentucky and Ohio and start to investigate the worker exposures. It turned into essentially a second career in moving forward in disaster research. So it was the first kind of investigations that NIOSH had gotten more formally involved with. Most of it was coming out of CDC in Atlanta, and they would send infectious disease docs to do most of the work. But we were trained, obviously, to be able to look at toxic exposures. And we're able to start moving into and thinking about what are the risks to workers in these types of environments. It was followed up about a month later in Grand Forks, North Dakota, when the whole town flooded, and it was the largest evacuation since World War II. So 60,000 people were evacuated, and ability to understand even more deeply about the risks to the workers and the community there. The agrochemical facilities that were there all emptied out and flooded the town. The downtown of the town burnt down. And then there were indoor releases of all this oil. All the homes were heated by home heating oil. And then those all broke and then released into the houses too. So some deeper opportunities. That led to working together with EPA. And HHS and EPA don't work together typically in response to things. But when we ended up in North Dakota, we actually joined forces, and EPA asked asked me to come out and start a program with them in Denver. That's how I ended up here. And what we did was we combined the EPA office and the HHS, Regional Health Administrator's office, to start to work together to think about these disaster situations or health emergencies for this region. So there's the 6 states, North, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, and to see if we could bring not just a CDC approach to health, but the whole HHS system. So we had HRSA and we had SAMHSA and we had, different agencies that are here, and they're still here and they're located here in the region, but trying to apply to health situations in this region that had public health value. Libby, Montana started in November of 1999. Are folks familiar with that? Okay, a couple of you. So Libby, Montana is really the worst situation still in EPA history. The town is in northwest Montana. It's a small town, and it was contaminated with asbestos. The asbestos came from a vermiculite mine, and has led to huge ramifications across the country. I'll talk about it briefly, but in terms of it's still the worst and largest EPA Superfund response, and not just because it's Libby, Montana, but it was all over the country. So the mine was started in the 1920s. It made vermiculite. Folks might be familiar with vermiculates in potting soil. They use it for swimming pools, etc. The mine was about 6 miles from town, and contaminated the whole area because the vermiculite was used by the population in all sorts of things. So it's used around the world. This is the largest vermiculite mine producer in the world at the time, and the vermiculite is a product that's okay if it's not contaminated with asbestos. In this case, it was contaminated with asbestos. So we screened the town within 6 months. We set up a medical screening program. About 18% of the population had pleural-related asbestos disease. There's several hundred deaths. So elevated risks of lung cancer, mesothelioma, et cetera, throughout the town. Here's pictures of the ball fields, and right next to the ball fields, you can see behind it, these were plants of the vermiculite and popping that the kids would play on. And then there's a picture of a person holding insulation bags, which were used around the country. So not only was it mined in Libby, Montana, but they shipped it to over 300 facilities around the country, several here in the Denver area, that were processing plants. So they would ship the vermiculite, which was unexfoliated, and ship it around the country and pop it, and then create contaminated areas all throughout. So here's a picture of kids playing in a plant in Minneapolis. And this is just a pile of the vermiculite waste that's there. And the one child in front there died at age 42 of asbestosis, which is really rare, and lung cancer. Also these areas, this is a picture of an area in Minneapolis where 10% of the population there had elevated asbestos-related pleural disease. So the other thing that it was used for was home insulation in millions of homes, still in millions of homes and businesses throughout the country. The issue here particularly is this pop vermiculite. If it's disturbed in the attic, the levels of asbestos exposure are extremely high. So the OSHA short-term exposure limit for a worker in protection for 15 minutes shouldn't be higher than one fiber per cc. It can exceed that by tenfold in a couple of minutes. So it's a really dangerous exposure. What we did was a number of different health studies. We really invested between EPA and HHS in toxicology studies, and we're able to deliver and worked on medical and mental health care for the town. So it was a response that we coordinated not only to work on the toxic exposures that we were working on, but also to provide the town with mental and healthcare services and specialty research, mitigation, and stuff still going on, but most of the EPA is done with it at this particular point. I'm happy to kind of talk about it. There's a couple of good books and some documentaries on it. So the hazardous asbestos exposures and mineral fiber exposure are throughout the West. Particularly, we started looking at, because it's always been an occupational disease, we started to look at it in terms of other locations and other types of environmental exposures that are going on around the country. One particular one that I'll just talk on briefly for a moment was in North Dakota, there's a fiber called erionite, which is very similar to asbestos, but was never used commercially. Asbestos is the commercial use of asbestos or mineral fibers. Erionite was used to pave roads throughout North Dakota. And it was reported back to EPA and US Geological Survey that they were using this product and had been using it for a number of years. And that a number of school roads and other roads were actually paved in it. So we undertook an investigation, which was really interesting, to try to not only characterize the roads and what people were being exposed to, but then to compare it. The issue of erionite is particularly impressive because these towns in Turkey have been identified that had erionite contamination, where about 30 to 50% of the people living in these towns are dying from mesothelioma. So it's a particular form of mineral fiber that has been shown in other pockets in the world to have really high mortality rates. So in order to understand, is the fiber that we're finding in North Dakota the same fibers that we're finding in Turkey? We actually did a combined research program with the Turkish government and went out to Turkey and actually did the sampling and compared the fibers in Turkey to what we were seeing in North Dakota. And lo and behold, they really do have a lot of similarities. And the exposures that we were seeing in North Dakota on these roads and in school buses were actually similar to some of the exposures that we were seeing in Turkey. World Trade Center attack came up. The group became very proficient at working on disasters here in Region 8. And the fact that we had a group that was working together between Department of Health and Human Services and EPA and trying to look at health and the environment in a hand-holding type way really gave us opportunities to be invited to and participate in a number of disasters around the country. The World Trade Center was particularly problematic, as folks know, with the release of the toxins and the exposures there. We went specifically down to the site for a while and looked at and characterized the exposures, worked with the city to identify cleanup ways. To go back to Libby vermiculite was used on the towers as insulation, as fireproofing insulation. And there was large concerns about that particular exposure, as well as when the towers came down from the other exposures. So high alkalinity and various volatile organics and everything else that was there. Folks are still experiencing very high rates of pulmonary disease as well as cancers. A month after that, the anthrax attack occurred, so just no rest for the weary. And if folks may remember, the anthrax attack started with letters that were sent. So they opened up one of the letters in the Hart Senate office building in Tom Daschle's office and contaminated the whole building. There were about 5 deaths that were related to these anthrax attacks. So the scientific question was, how do we clean this up? How do we even identify it? The holding was at the time is that if you had an anthrax spore, it would just settle and stick to whatever it was exposed to. So we actually felt, having worked on the mineral fiber stuff, that it aerosolizes, just like we saw in Libby. You know, you disturb that attic insulation, up it goes and away, and the exposures are high. So similarly, we went into the Hart anthrax building. This is myself and Chris Weiss, my colleague, on top of the Hart building. And we went in and sampled it. And lo and behold, the anthrax spores were all over the office, all over the building. We could sample it off computer screens. We could sample it, disturb things off, put it on sampling plates. So you can see here, they actually gutted the entire building and tore it down to the ground. And it was throughout the Washington area. There were a number of different investigations, but really understanding the exposure and understanding the fate and transport of the exposure was critical in the cleanup and how we approach these situations. I thought I'd get out of the disaster business after not being home for a long time, my kids getting pissed, that I would move to FDA. My friend was the assistant commissioner there at the time, and I went over to FDA and they handed me a portfolio. It was the influenza portfolio, which had been quiet. And they said, yeah, this will be good. You can work on this for a while and you won't be in disaster land. So about within a year, we had the H1N1. influenza epidemic, and it turned into a all hands nightmare. And the interesting thing was we were working on trying to, it was a chance too to move from the applied side of the world, and I've been working on applied environmental health, and working into kind of the policy side, and then thinking about how do we take findings of science and then translate that to policy, and then think about ways we can do that. So this was the Office of Counterterrorism at FDA. And it was thinking about, we take drugs, we take all the safety and efficacy of these things, but how do we start to deal with it if there's a disaster or if there's an anthrax outbreak, et cetera, and get medications to the public and get it to them fast in ways that we can. So this was the first emergency use authorization that we worked on. It became very, very visible just recently when we had the COVID and all those vaccines and everything that we pushed out come through that emergency use authorization and policy. The Gulf spill, when I switched over to NIH happened, I left FDA, went back to work on environmental health issues, which I was longing to get back into after a couple of years. And the Gulf spill happened about 3 weeks after I was at NIH. And thinking that NIH didn't do this type of work, I was wrong, because we had this worker training program that I mentioned. And the worker training program works on disasters. It's the only response group in NIH. But they would come out and they would support how workers are trained in disasters. And they would take information from NIOSH and others and say, what are the health and safety issues here for, in this case, the Gulf oil spill? So they were starting to do training on 130,000 cleanup workers. It's an immense operation across 4 states in the Gulf. At that time, we had decided we would field a cohort study. And we built a cohort study. We built other studies as well, but the cohort study was of 33,000 workers. It's still ongoing. A number of different issues related to it. There was a huge exposure reconstruction. No personal exposures were done, so we didn't get that kind of information of what somebody was individually exposed to. But EPA and others were getting data. There was 25,000 samples that had to be reconstructed. The 33,000 workers were enrolled in a study with multiple different levels of investigation of it. And then a notable number of different health outcomes, neurobehavioral, lung, cardiovascular, mental health. And specifically the dispersants were of interest. They had added to cleaning this up, they used chemical dispersants to try to reduce it. So there was millions of gallons of chemical dispersants that were used. So we started to think about how do we do this better? And the calling came out from Francis Collins and others in this article in New England Journal in 2013. This is a little bit after we started working on, a couple of years after we started the Gulf oil spill. But the call really about getting data, about responding to disasters in the country, about thinking through how we coordinate better to collect information and translate that, became a calling. And so we started the program. At the same time, my office, John Balpas, was working on creating climate change program. So we kind of created these hand in hand. But there was no formal way to coordinate the research in the country when things happen. You think the government's going to come out and CDC is going to get all this great data and tell everybody what to do. It's a mess. It's difficult to fund. There's ethical issues, training researchers, protocols, et cetera, community stakeholders. How do we really get a collective response that's effective and useful to communities? That we can help them and get the information we need so they can say, is it safe? Is my kid being affected? What do I think about the long-term health effects? What we saw right now in the East Palestine train derailment, which we're working on, and getting this kind of data. So I've transformed this model, which is a center, which is an EPA classic risk assessment model. You collect the dose, hazard identification, dose response, risk characterization, exposure. But really to the left is what the research side is. And that's really compelled by what we can do as academics and as agencies in filling out what do we understand about the human studies, the mechanistic studies, in vitro, toxicology, predictive modeling, interventions. How do we get good exposure data and be able to do that collectively as a community with researchers and with public health? And then how do you risk translate that to protective measures, mitigation, adaptation, communications, health and safety training, recovery, improved preparedness. So all of that type of componentry we started to think about and try to start building forward. So we started this DR2 program around 2013, 2014, building strategic resources, training and capacity building across the country, coordination, outreach, and engagement across the country to try to begin to socialize this. And of course, you know, who's your players? The Secretary of HHS for Preparedness and Response said, who's your partners? For CDC, it's public health. For us, it's you guys. We fund universities. That's our players. How do we bring our universities' skills and experience and talent, especially environmental health, exposure, toxicology, epidemiology, all of that, to the table to contribute to situations in the country that are growing, continuing to grow. We'll talk about climate change in a second, in a way that's useful and productive, not only to understanding the science, but to helping our communities. Some of the resources we built, it was a cool site. We started with this basic issue that we're not collecting information from situations that are acute in a systematic way to allow us to learn from them. Everybody would go out and start a new questionnaire. If you're dealing with a wildfire, and then you go out and collect some information, is it done in a way that we could validate it across other situations and compare and contrast what we learn, whether it's mental health or physiologic outcome. So we started building this website and building the tools and resources to allow us to do that. It became the site for the COVID-19 resources for all of NIH. And we started to build protocol builders and things about IRB approved protocols at our university levels, to use IRB approved protocols to be able to get out in the field. So NIH took a while to build this, but we have them and we're starting to make and apply those. To give you a feel of trying to do this, we said, okay, is this important? Should we be doing this in the country? We went out to California, met with the state health folks and emergency managers, and we brought a number of our center directors and centers to talk about this and have kind of this workshop, and began to build from there. And essentially, we used a scenario-based one. We said, if a tsunami hit LA, the port of LA, what would you do? How would you get environmental information? And the director of the California State Health Department said, no problem. I got a huge epi department. We would be out there and we would get all that kind of data and tell people what to do. And then quiet break. And then her lead of the epi department came up and said, no, we'll be too busy with the situation. We really don't have that capacity. And then they said, and then she turned back, she goes, okay, I'm interested. And all the academic centers were there. We had our core centers meeting. And they said, well, we can help. We do this stuff all the time. We collect this data. We have community engagement. We actually are in the city. We had LA, and we had UCLA, we had San Diego, we had all the folks there. We can contribute. So it started into our thinking about how to build out the program and how do we begin to fund this type of research going forward in the country. We started these workshops across the country. Latest one was in Seattle in 2022, using peer-reviewed IRB protocols, but relationships, et cetera. But here's just an example of what happened. We had this one in Houston in 2015, talking about, you know, if a hurricane would hit Houston, God forbid, that would never happen, but if it did. So in 2015, we had the workshop. We brought about 100 participants, school of public health, academic departments, Houston City, Texas state officials, talked it through, did the scenario. And when actually Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, they came back together. They had formed relationships. They had created thinking about this together and how they would collect information together. And look, you can see here, collaborations across Texas A&M, Rice, University of Texas, Baylor. Oregon State came down and provided wristbands so you could measure volatile organics. North Carolina, Mount Sinai came in with health questionnaires for mental health based on the World Trade Center. So the universities collaborated quickly together, and they combined with the public health department in Houston to apply science. Within 14 days, they were collecting data. They used cohorts that were pre-existing that they had been studying. You have all that here in Denver, and there's ways to capitalize and think about it. So let's think to switch to the climate change. So of course, climate is increasing in severity and frequency across the nation. This is our NOAA pals put this out and keep updating it all the time. You can see how it continues to get more and more severe and frequent. We formally launched our NIH Climate Change and Health Initiative in 2021. as executive orders from the White House. And John, we were talking about that earlier. So President Biden basically upped the ante. We had a program that my colleague John Balbus, who's now at the Office of Climate Change and Health for HHS, had started. It was small in NIH, and we had a few $1 million in a year, kind of focused on this space. When the executive order came down from the president, the agencies really took a closer look. And the new director of NIEHS, Dr. Wychick, met with the other directors and said, this is really important. What are we going to do? And they took an attitude of really joining together to talk about it as an NIH instead of one institute, which is unique. And how do we socialize? The question is, how do you socialize environmental health into our public? How do we take what we care about here and in this room to our community in different ways and into biomedical medicine? So these are the directors of NHLBI and the National Cancer Institute and others thinking about how is environment important. And that was a really important conversation to start this. The working group is now over 200 members. There's now 11 directors meeting every month to talk about environment and climate change. This is the framework of the initiative. So it's, again, in the center, transdisciplinary. It's what you guys are talking about. It's in your request for a chair for this department, is thinking about transdisciplinary, thinking about the core areas: health effects, health equity, training, capacity building, interventional science, surrounded by a partnership ring with areas of science. We incorporated the disaster research program that we have been developing right into the space as part of this, as well as other areas of science from adaptation research and interventions, risk exposure, and data integration, another hot topic. Underserved populations, I won't spend time here. Again, direct and indirect effects, we're thinking about it across the spectrum, not just the etiologic direct effects and measuring that, but how does climate change affect our systems, our chemical releases, interruptions to healthcare systems, economic, and we don't have any favorites. We're thinking and funding and trying and building this program, thinking forward. So right now, in the last year or so, with funding from Congress, and the funding from Congress came from a model that it was owned by not just NIEHS, it came from a model that it was owned across NIH. And that was really important. We've now funded 5 P20s. Those are the orange right here. You are the recipient of our Climate Change and Health Community Engagement Core Center, along with 3 others. Those are the blue. There is a research coordination center at Harvard and BU, which is called CAFE, which is masterfully creating our community of practice. It's a cooperative agreement for them to build coordination across all of this, as well with other partners. And we have 2 NSF partnering centers, because we're thinking about it not just as NIH, but how do we partner in the transdisciplinary fashion with NSF and others. And so we have the Colorado Natural Hazard Center and the Rapid Facility at University of Washington. I'll briefly talk about those real quick because they're really important now as ways to allow you as an environmental health group and department to fund and do research in this space more effectively. So the Natural Hazard Center is now funded to provide rapid grants to research community to be able to collect data. The NIH system is insufficient to get money out the door quickly. Our time-sensitive grant mechanism at NIEHS is about 6 months, 4 to 6 months. Too slow to capture what we always miss, which is exposure data and all this cohort enumeration and all that type of work. So now we can do it within 2 weeks, using the Natural Hazard Centers. You can apply for them for rapid grants, and they're putting them out. The Rapid Facility at University of Washington is gearing up to provide the research community with tools, equipment, to be able to collect exposure data. We've been meeting with John Vokins and other people across the country that do exposure work. We're going to supply the research community with the instrumentation and tools. So you can go to Natural Hazard Center here at University of Colorado Boulder and get a grant, and then go get the equipment at University of Washington. So that should be, University of Washington is about to start buying the equipment. The last thing I'll mention before we get into the last piece of this is about data integration. And this was a piece that we started working on during COVID as a federal interagency White House working group, and said, the interest of NASA and NOAA and others was about making their data available so we can use it for health. And they said, what can we do in this space? We formed a working group and we started to think this through. We ended up creating this proposal you can see here on the left about thinking about environmental data sources, whether they're geospatial, environmental data, social determinants of health, even your mobile watches, et cetera, and combining that with health, combining it with electronic health records, NIH cohorts, whether it's All of Us study, cohorts that we have in-house called PEGS, which is a cohort in North Carolina, and start to work through that. We went to, I went to what's called the Patient Center Outcome Research Trust Fund. There's PCOR and there's PCOR TIF, which funds the federal data ecosystem. And we got funding to now build this program. One is to build a catalog of resources for the research community. Say, well, I'm interested in PM 2.5. Where do I get that for this community? I want wildfire smoke. I want to be able to look at that. What are the data sources? We're building this catalog. It's going to go live probably within a month. We're working on data integration, standardized linked data sets, some of the things that working with NCIs, working on the SEER data set. So bringing it together and creating use cases for the research community. So this is going to be open resource tools. Also, the CAFE has a data component. I mentioned the CAFE, which is the Research Coordination Center for the Climate Change and Health component. There's also, so there's a way to start linking and energizing the ability to use data, environmental data, collected from NOAA, NASA, and others, in a way to start linking it to health with tutorials and training and APIs and different types of platforms to allow the research community to use this data. So if you want to look at health outcomes, from wildfire smoke, you could start to link your records and your data sets to it. So let's think about, I guess for the last few minutes, about here and being here in Colorado. And I guess my thinking about this position. So John asked me to think about that and to comment about, I guess, a bit of vision and what I could do with this opportunity. So, I think there's an opportunity to build a really cool, transdisciplinary, mission-driven environmental health department here. And my personal passions, as you can see from my career trajectory, has been certainly on disasters and climate change, and in this space about how do we measure and apply environment to our communities in meaningful ways. Certainly the transdisciplinary science and opportunity to do interventions, implementation, dissemination science. But the issue for us in environmental health is we don't have valid interventions yet that we're using for implementation. So we have to use methodologies that are going to allow us to not only collect that while we're doing etiologic research, but starting to think about collecting and doing interventional research, and then implementation and dissemination. We're going to have to use hybrid methodologies. The exposure science, exposomics, which is kind of the internal milieu, thinking about that going forward, and rapid toxicology approaches. So we can actually measure exposures and then think about what are they doing in terms of toxicological, especially complex mixed exposures. Data integration, and then community engagement and risk communications. Our risk communications are clearly challenged. We could see coming out of COVID, our situation, communicating with the public needs to evolve as fast and as smart as what's happening out there from the advertising communities and others. Public health is way behind the ball. We're gonna have to get much more creative about risk communication, especially in this space, to be effective. So you have a loose framework I was kind of thinking about the various assets and opportunities. Certainly the School of Public Health and its relationship to Anschutz and their climate change and health medical training and residency program, trying to kind of get a feel for what you guys are doing and talking to some of the folks here and what's kind of potentially on the table. Colorado State University with their One Health toxicology and exposure activities, certainly grounded a lot in animal research originally and moving into the One Health area. And you have your 3 NIOSH academic centers, and now our new community engagement center, which is here as well. I'm not sure if there's much going on, particularly at UNC in Greeley. And then certainly this opportunity to build transdisciplinary work at UC Boulder. And of course, you have government agencies and the NGOs in this space. I see that this region, and here's just the picture on the right of, our NIEHS research and training centers, of which we have about 50 to 60. It's empty in the middle of the country. The Intermountain West is really devoid of having this kind of capacity. Critical issues in the region, throughout this region for CCA, climate change and health research and capacity building. Strong academics and research across these CEO campuses. You've got great talent. You've got great work going on in these different areas. This is the largest encampment of federal agencies outside of Washington, D.C. I've worked with USGS, EPA, NIOSH, they're all here. They all have programs here. And those people are all wanting to work with academics in this space. They're interested in not only working with students, talking to students, thinking about how to bring academics in. We haven't created those bridges to a thriving metro area. I can't believe how much Denver has grown since I was here. I haven't grown any taller, but Denver has. And a recent NSF award, it just went to CU Boulder for $165 million in this space. So what's the health analog to that? Academic growth opportunities. I think you can enhance your transdisciplinary curriculum and outreach to bring in students, grow classrooms, fuel graduate programs, harness the interest that's out there in ways and be able to highlight and advocate that. I think a master's program to complement your MPH program would be useful and help you grow that particular space. Strengthening mentoring for future careers in applied science, policy, successful grantsmanship and research. Engage with local public health and research agencies to fuel student interests and opportunities, and leverage local situations and community concerns to involve in tech applied science and policy. Use what's here. You have much to build on. There's situations going on. How do we engage students to be part of those situations, whether it's the work that Kathy Dickinson's doing in the Front Range or in San Luis, the mountain area, and the situations that are occurring, the wildfire, in this case, is the fire that broke out through Boulder and displaced 45,000 people in a day. So the opportunities to think about how do we apply the academics in a fastidious way. I was trying to think about how do we bring these strategic investments. I guess this is kind of in the way. Let me see if I can move it. Let me stick it over here. Building research in the department through strategic investments. Time, money, energy, relationships to spur shared interest, equities, and assets in environmental occupational health. So who's the family? Well, it sounds like to me, the family at least is this hub here at Anschutz, and how to connect medical to environmental health. And we were discussing a bit earlier, about what does it mean to bring environmental health into the medical establishment? How do we understand healthcare outcomes in terms of environmental risk factors? We're doing with social determinants of health, but it should be spread throughout the medical disciplines, not only etiologic research, but patient health outcomes. So if you have somebody who's a mental health patient who's on neuroleptics and it's high heat, it's affecting, I'm in the space that I want to be for us. It's affecting the way that they're treating those patient outcomes. Exactly. And understanding and making those connections. The other parts, partners, Colorado State, UC Boulder, bolstering energies and opportunities across School of Public Health, connect EHS to the medical establishments that I was mentioning, connect to UC Boulder, engage and collaborate with these agencies that are here and ready to go, and non-local academic centers. I think there's opportunities to really build these partnerships across these other environmental health centers and research institutions. You guys do it at a individual level, you collaborate all the time, but not at a strategic level. It's not thoughtful and strategic. We can talk about this. I think this was my last slide. Yeah, that was it. All right, John. I'll talk about this building. Thanks.
Thanks, Aubrey. We have time for questions, comments, conversation.
Enjoyed your presentation, Aubrey. Thank you. So I had a question. You were mentioning these standardized data sources now linking health data to environmental data. And you had some examples like SEER and things like up there. One challenge I was wondering if you could speak to in Colorado with a large portion of the state in rural areas. How do you go about, I mean, it's easy to find data oftentimes in big metro areas, right? Where there are a lot of monitors,
Yeah.
things like that. What do you do in rural areas where,
So the first part of it is taking any data, right? So what do we do? I mean, partly it's been, that, they're collecting, NASA's collecting tempos online now. So that the new tempo satellites, they're collecting this, and the tempo satellites can give you beyond particulate matter and density and optical density, and give you volatile organics and different things down the range. They're collecting it, but we're not using it, right? So you can get geospatial data at a certain level. You're not going to get you're going to get your EPA air quality stationary, but there'll be less in rural areas. You're going to have much less of it. So it's using what data you can and bringing some of that and bringing that to health, right, in an effective way. We haven't been doing that. So there's huge interest. We had a meeting with we had a retreat with 11 NIH directors recently talking about climate change, which was fascinating for them to spend a day talking about climate change and thinking about how do we bring data, not only this, but environmental data to their health. They're all biomedical for the most part, National Heart, Lung, and Blood, NCI, and National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. But they're thinking about how to use environmental data more effectively and what are the sources. We're going to continue to have to build on some of this. And people are collecting stuff more and more. And they have wristbands and things that we're going to start to do more and have more capacity. To me, it's amazing how much it's grown and our ability to get to a place now that we can use different types of environmental data that's being collected in a more effective way and start to join it. So yeah, stay tuned. I mean, part of it's right now is the integration of the data so complicated because it's collected, at different temporal and spatial scales, different analytes and sensitivities, and trying to then smooth that over to patient level data at what might be zip code or statistical district or county, in ways that give you meaning and allow you to use it. So, and the other part is that most of our research community aren't data scientists to do it. So who you have the data science? So we're trying to create these resources to let people do it. And there's a lot of tools out there. There's EJ Screen from EPA, and those are more dashboard type tools. They're not really great for you doing research. These will hopefully give people tools to do research.
I'll throw out a question.
Sure.
With topic we haven't touched on. So with global scene, so there's work going on in Mexico around the mysterious epidemic of renal disease,
Yeah.
agricultural workers. Katie was in Rwanda, with GeoHealth Health Program. I'm active in this and that a long time, and there's others. Say a little bit about where an academic department with us sitting here in Colorado might be thinking of that.
Yeah, but I mean, you guys are doing it, right? So Lee Newman's heavily involved in the chronic kidney disease and Mesoamerica, so it's this opportunity of how do we think about funding in this space as well and generating, and in terms of creating linkages. So GeoHealth is a good example of a combined project that was NIOSH and Fogarty and NIEHS were parts of it. We are thinking about it now, especially in terms of climate change, right? And so trying to bring it in a much more strategic way. Climate change was funded, again, very disproportionately and non-strategically. So I think what you're seeing, and even with our centers, we're starting to say, what is the capacity building, John? So it's partly about building capacity locally. We're talking about different hubs around the world and ways to build capacity. But as an academic department here locally, it's, again, where's your science and interest to some degree, and what can you kind of do, but also how do you create some linkages to others that are doing that type of work? I think the network that we're building in CAFE, this network across not only the US, but globally, there was there was several thousand people on the first meeting of that research coordination center. You guys should be part of it. It's open to everybody. You don't have to be just an NIH grantee or P20 center. You guys have the community engagement center, so you're already in. But you should be able to start to link in and have those conversations and connect with this growing community of practice. And that's what they're focused on doing. Nice thing too about CAFE and NSF, we're meeting with NSF now strategically to talk about how do we create true transdisciplinary funding in this space. Not only get our communities working together, folks at the Natural Hazard Center funded by NSF and the new NSF grants and things that we are funding, in a way that creates science and career paths for people that aren't just, I'm just going to go here and get my money and I'll stick to this area. But we can build some true interdisciplinary work.
Thanks.
I have one other quick
Sure,
question.
yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about our role as a School of Public Health and training the public health workforce, what would be our priority? If we, and maybe start with your comment about a master's program that would complement the MPH, but how would we structure our training so that we could produce the best people possible to address the kinds of things that you showed?
Yeah. Well, you're gonna have to build it iterative wise. It's, you know, it's what you have for your faculty and your program. One is the signaling of this is where we're going. I mean, I think that's really important. I think NIH finds that, you know, even us starting to partner with NSF throws a signal. So as a department, as your school is signaling, it's not just environmental health department. We are taking that. And I think, and you had that comment, and I think it's in your School of Public Health thing that I put in there. This is important. The science that we're creating here is important. And whether you're coming at it from purely environmental health or EPI or community-based work contributes. And how we contribute to this conversation and our science is a good critical step. I think then bringing in and building expertise as you can. You're going to need assistant professors and tenured assistant professors and others to get a stream of younger career folks starting to come in here as well. So I think you have to use a multi-pronged approach to some degree. Some of it's highlighting and energizing the communications about it. It's investments. I think the NIH did a really interesting a way of approaching this model. We had no monies to start, and they started with saying, we're going to own it across, and this would be the case of across schools here or across schools and departments, and saying, we're going to come up with a strategy to start to address this and use a more collective wisdom to it, is a great way to start to indicate it. And then you can think about ways to fund. We can talk about stuff like that when I meet with you later. But I think those are some of the basic things. There's interest out there. I mean, it's clear you can't open a paper right now without seeing things about climate or some disaster or something. I think the stuff that you guys are doing with your community engagement center, those types of investments and resources are really great. I mean, the issue that we were thinking about from NIH, which came off the HEAL program from COVID, was how do we create truly sustainable community engaged partnerships and relationships that then we could build research with, not off of, but with, and continue to do that. Those are really cool projects. You have others, I'm sure, around that you could think about, but I think engaging students more and more into those particular programs, it seeds their interests about applied work and seeing what applied work can look like. And then hopefully it'll fuel a stream both from undergraduate to graduate levels of people not only being energized and interested in this space, which, you know, I'm clearly, and we're here, are passionate about, but you need to also give them, you know, I was thinking about this, you know, the center here, this last slide that's up, you have to give them a place to come at the end. So right now you have occupational health centers. You really need that environmental hubs, whether it's a hub or a center or something. You need that centering piece for the health side, one that can connect with what's happening at the NSF work that's being done on engineering and climate adaptation work out of UC Boulder. There's no health component to it. So that we need to build that piece into the system.
We have the last question, Sam.
Question, I hope. I was excited by the template the other day, some of the data analytics that you talked about. But I'm wondering, what sort of computing power would be to analyze that data?
Yeah. Well, and the good thing is we're actually building things that'll help people to do that. So, and, you know, again, we're nascent, and there's other, you know, the cool thing is we have we have quarterly meetings with other agencies and other academic partners. So if you're interested in this space, like, you can come to these stakeholder engagement forums. We set this up now with Patient-Centered Outcome Trust Fund. So we have these quarterly meetings to come and talk about just those types of topics and what you're doing. So there's that kind of piece that we meet. But we're trying to build it so it's to really empower the researchers. You know, whether you want to bring your own health data set and combine it, or whether you have some of the capabilities and want to use different pieces. Some of it's, you know, even just tutorials to help researchers say, oh, I have point data or roster data, or I have different types of data, and to be able to use that data and the models that would be useful to you. So our Chord's website's up. It'll be, and I said that catalog will be out within a month. But certainly happy to, you know, connect you, and it's all, you know, this is all being built to the research community's benefit.
Well, great. I think, thanks again, Aubrey. for
Thanks, John.
speaking with us. Good to have you here.
Thanks.
You get a break.
I get a break.
You get a break. You even get that lunch, you're gonna have 40
I,
sandwiches.
yeah, I nibbled before you guys did, so I was good. Because I'm 2 hours later, so I figured I'd be really happy. I will see you at dinner, I guess. Yeah.